It began on an ordinary Saturday that felt like every other day in the quiet suburb of Maple Ridge, California. The sun hung low, spilling gold over trimmed lawns and freshly washed cars. Families strolled with dogs tugging at leashes. Kids coasted down driveways on scooters, their laughter echoing between the trees. And Ava Coleman, 36, a graphic designer who worked from home, was walking back from the neighborhood park with a water bottle in one hand and her phone in the other, scrolling through messages from her sister. It should have been just another peaceful walk. But that afternoon, peace had a different plan. Two men stepped out from behind a silver SUV parked crookedly near the curb, blocking her path. They wore dark blue polo shirts with the words "Neighborhood Safety Patrol" stitched on the chest in white thread. Ava blinked, unsure if they were joking. The taller one, Brent, had close-cropped blonde hair and a permanent scowl that looked carved into his face. The shorter one, Dylan, thick-built and broad-shouldered, rested one hand on his belt as if he were some kind of authority. "You live around here?" Brent asked, his tone clipped and cold. Not curious, but commanding. Ava stopped. "Yes, Maple Ridge Lane." "Why?" Dylan smirked. "Routine check. Need to see your ID." Ava frowned. "My ID? I'm walking home, not driving." "Who are you with?" "We're with the neighborhood association," Brent replied sharply. "There have been reports of strangers walking through the community. Gotta keep everyone safe." Ava tilted her head. "I've lived here for 3 years, and I've never heard of patrols asking for ID." Brent's eyes narrowed. "Rules are rules, ma'am." Something about his voice sent a chill down her spine. It wasn't the kind of authority that came from duty. It was the kind that came from control. "I'm not showing my ID to strangers on the street," Ava said firmly, gripping her phone tighter. "If you're with the HOA, I'll talk to the president directly." Dylan stepped closer. "We said ID. Now." The air around them thickened. Ava's heartbeat quickened. The sound of children playing nearby faded as tension swallowed the moment whole. Then it happened, so fast she almost didn't register it. Dylan's hand snapped across her face. The slap cracked like a whip in the warm afternoon air. Ava stumbled, her phone slipping from her hand and clattering against the pavement. Her cheek flared with pain. A nearby jogger gasped. A woman walking a stroller froze mid-step, eyes wide. "What is wrong with you?" Ava shouted, clutching her face. Brent sneered. "People like you think the rules don't apply. We're just doing our job." Her mind reeled. Job? This wasn't enforcement, it was assault. Across the street, a teenager lifted his phone, recording. A man on his porch called out, "Hey, you can't hit her," but most people just stood frozen, unsure what to do. Ava forced herself upright, swallowing the rising panic. Her voice shook, but her words didn't. "I live here, you don't get to touch me." Brent smirked again. "Maybe you need an escort back home. Make sure you actually belong." That threat landed like a knife. Neighbors began murmuring, a few edging closer. Ava's trembling hands hovered over her phone. She tried to call her husband but could barely press the buttons through the blur of fear. Then, salvation. A man jogging by stopped, his phone out. "Back off," he said loudly. "I'm calling the police." Brent's fake confidence faltered. Dylan clenched his fists but didn't move. Ava's cheek burned where his hand had struck. She took deep breaths, repeating the words her husband had taught her. "Stay calm. Keep control. You're going to regret this," she whispered to herself. And she was right, because less than 10 minutes later, that call would reach someone who had no patience for bullies pretending to be heroes. Someone who knew exactly how to deal with men like them. His name was Ethan Coleman, Ava's husband, and once he was the man people called when trouble needed to be stopped fast. Ethan Coleman was in the garage when the call came. He was tightening a loose bolt on the lawnmower, humming faintly to the sound of a local radio station, when his phone buzzed on the workbench. He almost ignored it until he saw the name flashing across the screen. Grace Lewis, their next-door neighbor. He answered casually at first. "Hey, Grace, what's up?" Her voice came through trembling and rushed. Ethan, it's Ava. She's been attacked. 2 men. They said they were with the HOA or something. You need to come. Now. The wrench slipped from his hand, clattering against the concrete. For a split second, the world around him went silent. What did you just say? He asked, his voice suddenly sharper, lower. Grace repeated it, her tone panicked now. They hit her, Ethan. She's near the park on Cedar Trail. The police are on their way. But he didn't wait for the rest. The phone hit the workbench, still connected, as Ethan grabbed his keys and bolted out the door. His heart pounded, steady and heavy, every beat fueling his steps. Years of military discipline hadn't dulled his reflexes, but this was different. This wasn't a mission. This was personal. His truck engine roared as he tore out of the driveway. Tires screeched against asphalt, and the world blurred past him. Houses, trees, street signs. All he saw in his mind was Ava's face, hurt, afraid. He'd faced danger on foreign soil. He'd seen men try to break him, but nothing had ever hit harder than the thought of someone laying a hand on his wife. He gripped the steering wheel so tight his knuckles turned white. You picked the wrong woman, he muttered under his breath, and the wrong husband. When he turned onto Cedar Trail, the flashing red of taillights and the silhouettes of people filled the road. Dozens of neighbors stood scattered, phones raised, voices low. Then he saw her. Ava stood near the curb, one hand pressed to her cheek, her face pale but her eyes locked forward. Grace was by her side, holding her arm steady, and across from her, the 2 men. They looked smaller now, surrounded by a crowd, their security shirts damp with sweat. But the moment they saw Ethan step out of his truck, their shoulders tensed. He didn't run. He didn't shout. He walked. Slow. Controlled. Each step a warning. People whispered his name as he passed. A few neighbors murmured, "That's her husband." Others backed away instinctively, sensing the tension brewing in the air. Ava's eyes found his. Relief washed over her expression. "Ethan," she whispered, voice cracking. He reached her in seconds, cupping her face gently, inspecting the swelling. "Who did this?" She pointed at them. "The one with the shaved head hit me. The other just watched." Ethan's expression hardened. The calm on his face wasn't peace, it was precision. Controlled fury, sharpened by years of discipline. He turned to Brent and Dylan. "You touched my wife?" Brent folded his arms, forcing a smirk. "You must be the husband." She refused to show ID, got mouthy. "That's honor." Dylan chuckled under his breath. "You should teach your woman some respect." The crowd murmured, a low ripple of disbelief. Ethan didn't raise his voice. "You assaulted a woman in broad daylight. You think that's respect?" Brent shrugged, trying to reclaim control. "She broke the rules. We enforce them. You don't scare us, tough guy." Ethan's posture barely changed. His words came out slow, deliberate. "You're not dealing with rules anymore. You're dealing with consequences." The shorter man, Dylan, stepped forward, chest puffed out. "You gonna hit us, hero? Go ahead." "I dare you." Ethan took a single step forward, closing the distance. The air between them tightened. "No, you'll make that choice yourself." Every muscle in his body was still coiled. He wasn't there to start a fight. But if one came to him, he'd finish it. The street fell silent. The only sounds were the whisper of the wind through the trees and the faint hum of approaching sirens in the distance. Ava watched him, torn between fear and trust. She had seen this side of him before, the stillness that came right before chaos. Brent tilted his head, sneering. "We're handling neighborhood business here. You're just..." Ethan cut him off. "You touched my wife." "That's not neighborhood business. That's assault," the smirk faltered. A flicker of unease crossed Brent's eyes, though he tried to mask it with bravado. "You threatening us?" Ethan's gaze didn't waver. "No, I'm giving you a chance to stay down when this ends." The shorter man laughed harshly. "Big word, soldier boy." That word, soldier, rolled off his tongue like an insult. He didn't know who he was talking to. Ethan didn't answer. He didn't have to. The quiet was louder than any threat. Ava's cheek throbbed, but she whispered softly, "Ethan, please, don't." He turned his head slightly, his voice gentle. "It's all right, sweetheart. I'm here." Then, facing the men again, it changed. Calm steel. "But you two made a mistake you won't forget." Brent smirked, taking the bait. "Prove it." He stepped forward, chest to chest with Ethan, trying to intimidate him. Dylan moved in beside him, cracking his knuckles. The crowd collectively held its breath. Ethan stayed perfectly still. Then, as if time itself shifted, Dylan swung. His punch never landed. Ethan's hand shot up, catching his wrist midair. In one swift motion, he twisted and dropped him to the ground. Dylan cried out, his arm pinned against his own chest. Brent lunged next, roaring in frustration. Ethan sidestepped, his shoulder connecting just enough to send Brent crashing backward into the curb. Gasps erupted around them. Phones lifted higher. Ava's breath caught. Her husband hadn't even broken a sweat. Brent groaned, trying to rise. "You're dead, man." Ethan crouched slightly, voice steady, dangerous in its calm. "Stay down, because if you don't, I'll make sure you remember why you should have." Dylan tried again, lunging clumsily. Ethan moved like water, redirecting his momentum and sending him sprawling face first into the grass. The street filled with a stunned silence. Then came the sirens. Flashing red and blue lights cut through the air as police cruisers screeched to a halt. Officers jumped out, hands near their holsters, until they took in the scene. 2 men on the ground, one calm figure standing tall above them, his wife beside him, bruised but safe, hands where we can see them. An officer called instinctively. Ethan raised his hands slowly, his tone even. "They're your problem now." The neighbors began shouting over one another. He didn't start it. "They hit her first." "It's all on camera." Phones waved in the air like proof. The officers moved in, cuffing Brent and Dylan, dragging them to their feet. Both men protested, still clinging to their crumbling story. "We're security," Brent yelled. "We work for the neighborhood." An officer held up their fake badges, shaking his head. "You're not security. You're impersonators, and you're under arrest." As the cruiser's lights reflected across the houses, Ava leaned into Ethan's chest, her voice breaking softly. "What if you hadn't gotten here in time?" He wrapped an arm around her shoulders. "Then they'd still be standing. And that's something I couldn't live with." She exhaled shakily, pressing her face into his chest. "You didn't even hit them hard." He smiled faintly. "Didn't have to." And as the police led the imposters away, the neighborhood stood in silence, realizing that peace was never about quiet streets. It was about people willing to stand up when silence failed. The flashing lights faded from the street, but the tension didn't. For a long moment, no one moved. The air itself seemed to hold its breath. Ava stood close to Ethan, her fingers still trembling slightly, eyes darting between the officers and the faces of neighbors watching from their porches. The same people who had once waved when she passed now whispered in tight circles. Some looked at her with sympathy, others with uncertainty, as if they were still deciding what side of the story they believed. The shorter officer, the one who had first drawn his weapon, finally lowered it. He approached Ethan with a nod of respect. "Sir, we're going to need a statement, but from what I'm hearing, you showed remarkable restraint." Ethan's jaw tightened. "I didn't want to fight. I wanted to stop one." The officer gave a faint smile, scribbling notes. "Well, you did both." Ava barely heard them. Her mind was replaying the slap, the sting, the moment everything changed. When the paramedic offered to check her face, she waved him off with a quiet, "I'm fine," though the throbbing said otherwise. Grace stayed by her side, hand on her shoulder. "You don't have to be brave right now," she whispered. Ava gave a small nod, her eyes glassy. "I'm just trying to believe this really happened, that right here on our street, people could pretend to be protectors and become predators." The officer overheard and sighed. "We're seeing this more often lately. Fake patrols, self-appointed watch groups. They find gated communities or HOA areas and start acting like they own the place." Ethan's brow furrowed. "So they weren't just targeting her?" "Probably not," the officer said. "We'll know more after we dig into their phones and vehicle. But they came prepared, zip ties, batons, fake IDs. They weren't improvising." A chill ran through Ava's body. She thought about what might have happened if no one had stepped in. Within hours, the story spread. Police tape went up. A crowd of residents gathered, trading speculation like gossip currency. News vans appeared before sunset, their antennas rising like curious heads. By morning, the story was everywhere. Fake. Security guards attack resident in Maple Ridge. The headline screamed from every local site. Ava woke to her phone buzzing nonstop. Messages from coworkers, extended family, people she hadn't heard from in years. Some sent support. Others sent questions that didn't feel like kindness at all. What did you say to them? Did you provoke them? Were you alone? Each message carved a little deeper. When she walked outside to check the mail 2 days later, she could feel the shift. A few neighbors waved warmly, but others crossed the street. One woman even pulled her daughter closer, whispering something Ava couldn't hear but didn't need to. That night, Ethan found her sitting at the dining table staring at her untouched tea. The swelling on her cheek had faded, but her eyes carried something heavier. He sat beside her. "Talk to me." She kept her gaze fixed on the mug. "It's not just what happened, it's how people are acting now. Like I did something wrong for standing up." "You didn't," he said firmly. Her fingers traced the rim of the mug. "Then why does it feel like I did? Some of the neighbors think I overreacted. That if I'd just shown my ID, none of it would have happened." Ethan's tone deepened. "They're trying to make sense of something that scares them. It's easier to blame you than to admit danger was right on their doorstep." She looked up finally, eyes glistening. "I keep thinking about those first seconds. Everyone saw, everyone heard, but hardly anyone moved. I felt invisible." He reached over, covering her hand with his. "You weren't invisible. You were brave." Ava's voice cracked. "Bravery shouldn't hurt like that." Ethan gave a small nod. "No, but sometimes it does." The following week, the Homeowners Association held an emergency meeting in the community clubhouse. Every chair was filled. Some people stood in the back, whispering before the meeting even began. The HOA president, Mark Heller, cleared his throat at the microphone. "First, we want to make it clear that the individuals involved had no connection to this organization. They were impersonators. They do not represent this neighborhood or its values." Someone in the crowd shouted, "Then why did we see them? Patrolling for weeks, why didn't anyone check who they were?" Mark hesitated. "They looked official. They wore uniforms, had radios. We assumed." Ethan exchanged a glance with Ava. Assumed. That single word hung heavy in the air. When the microphone opened for residents, Lydia Shaw, an older woman known for her bluntness, stood. "I feel for Ava, truly, but this whole thing got blown out of proportion. Maybe those men were rude, but people are saying she got confrontational first. If she'd just cooperated, maybe it wouldn't have escalated." A hush fell over the room. Ethan's jaw flexed. Ava's heart pounded in her chest, but she rose to her feet before he could. Her voice trembled at first, but then steadied. "So my choices were obedience or violence? Because I said no to strangers demanding my ID, I deserve to be hit?" Lydia crossed her arms, unflinching. "I'm saying things can get misunderstood." Ethan's voice cut through like steel. "There's no misunderstanding when a man strikes a woman in front of witnesses." The room was dead silent for a beat. Then Grace stood up, her voice shaking with emotion. "I was there, I saw it. She didn't provoke anyone. Those men came looking for power and they found someone they thought they could intimidate." One by one, a few others nodded, murmuring agreement. But the divide was already forming. Half the room looked ready to rally behind Ava. The other half whispered to each other, suspicion already taking root. After the meeting, some neighbors offered quiet words of comfort. Others avoided eye contact entirely. On the drive home, Ava stared out the window. "I thought moving here meant peace." Ethan kept his eyes on the road. "Peace isn't a place. It's what you make of it when chaos knocks." At home, she sat on the couch while he made tea. When he brought it to her, she smiled faintly, but didn't drink it. "It feels different now," she said softly. "Everything does." He sat beside her, wrapping an arm around her shoulders. "Then we'll make it different again." She leaned into him, but her gaze drifted toward the window. Outside, the quiet streets of Maple Ridge looked calm again. Too calm. The kind of calm that feels like a secret waiting to be told. And she couldn't shake the feeling that something about those men wasn't random, that maybe, somewhere, the story wasn't over yet. The days that followed blurred into a strange rhythm. News crews came and went. Police cars patrolled the neighborhood more often. And still, whispers moved faster than the wind. By the end of the week, it wasn't just Maple Ridge talking. The entire county knew about the attack. Every headline framed it differently. Some called Ava a victim. Others painted her as a spark that ignited neighborhood tensions. She stopped checking the articles altogether. The words felt like wounds she hadn't agreed to reopen. Ethan noticed the change in her before she did. She smiled less, spoke softly, moved carefully as if each step through their home required permission. He hated it. One evening, he came home to find her sitting on the back patio, staring at the line of trees that bordered their yard. The sky was a deep blue, almost navy, fading into the horizon. The air smelled of jasmine and sprinklers. "You haven't been out much," he said quietly. She didn't turn around. "It's easier to stay where people can't look at me like I'm trouble." He stepped closer. "You didn't do anything wrong." Her voice was barely a whisper. "Then why do I feel like I did?" He pulled up a chair beside her, resting his elbows on his knees. "Because people are scared. When fear spreads, someone always gets blamed. But fear doesn't decide who you are. You do." She took a deep breath, finally meeting his eyes. "I want to believe that." "Then start by walking again," he said softly. "Not for them. For you." Ava stared at the trees for a long moment before nodding slowly. "Tomorrow." The next day she laced her sneakers and stepped out just as the sun began to rise. The air was crisp, fresh, untainted by gossip or judgment. She walked down Cedar Trail, past the houses that had once felt welcoming and now felt like strangers watching through curtains. A few neighbors waved hesitantly. Some offered awkward smiles. Others pretended to be busy watering plants or adjusting mailboxes. But when she reached the park, the same place it had all begun, she stopped. Her hands trembled slightly. She could still picture it. The SUV, the voices, the sting. Her body remembered before her mind did. But then she saw Grace jogging toward her, smiling. "You did it," Grace said, slowing to a stop beside her. "I was hoping I'd see you out here again." "I almost turned back," Ava admitted. "Yeah, but you didn't." For the first time in weeks, Ava smiled without forcing it. "No, I didn't." That night, the calm was broken by a knock on the door. Ethan opened it to find Detective Ramos, the officer who'd first taken their statement. He held a folder under one arm and a grave expression on his face. "Sorry to drop by unannounced," Ramos said, "but you're going to want to hear this in person." Ava appeared behind Ethan, her pulse quickening. "It's about the men, isn't it?" Ramos nodded. "We ran their records. Neither of them lived anywhere near Maple Ridge. They'd been moving from community to community, pretending to be security. We found maps, lists of neighborhoods, even message threads online where they talked about keeping areas clean." Ethan's eyes darkened. "Clean?" "Yeah," Ramos said quietly. "Targeting people they didn't think belonged. It wasn't random. They watched her for days before they made their move." The words hit Ava like a punch. "So I was chosen?" They picked houses where one person was often alone, usually women. "Especially women they thought no one would defend," Ramos said. "But they didn't expect someone like you to stand up. Or someone like your husband to show up." Ethan exhaled slowly, the kind of breath that carried both rage and relief. "Are they still in custody?" "For now," Ramos replied. "But the investigation's bigger than we thought. We've already linked them to similar cases across the state. They weren't just pretending to be security. They were testing boundaries, seeing how far they could go before anyone stopped them." Ava's stomach turned. "They'd have kept going." Ramos nodded. "You stopped them from getting to someone who might not have." When he left, the house fell silent again. Ethan closed the door and turned to her. "You heard him. You didn't just survive this. You stopped something worse." She shook her head. "Then why does it still feel like they won?" Because they took your peace, he said. Now we take it back. The next HOA meeting came with tension you could feel before you even stepped inside. The community clubhouse buzzed with low murmurs, people divided into small clusters like rival camps. Mark Heller stood at the front again, shuffling papers nervously. We've received confirmation from the police that the suspects were not affiliated with our organization. They've been connected to a larger impersonation ring. That being said, Ava stood before he could finish. Her voice cut through the room. That being said what, Mark? That we just move on? Pretend it's over? Murmurs rippled through the crowd. Mark looked flustered. We're taking steps to— You can't take steps if you don't understand what happened, Ava continued. Those men weren't enforcing rules. They were enforcing hate. And the only reason I'm standing here is because I said no. Because someone else stepped in when everyone else stayed quiet. Some people clapped softly. Others looked down, uneasy. From the back, Lydia's voice rang out again. We all feel bad about what happened, Ava. But not everything's about hate. Sometimes things just get out of hand. Ava turned toward her, steady but firm. Getting out of hand is when a rule disagreement turns into shouting, not when a man hits a woman in broad daylight. That's not out of hand. That's cruelty. The silence that followed was heavy enough to make the air feel still. Ethan watched her, pride flickering in his eyes. For the first time since that day, she wasn't trembling. She was taking back the space that had been stolen from her. Mark finally spoke again. Quieter now. You're right. And as of today, this HOA will no longer allow any unofficial patrols. Every security presence must be licensed, verified, and registered. We owe you that much. Ava nodded once, then sat down beside Ethan. The meeting continued, but she barely heard it. Something inside her had shifted. Outside, when they walked back to the car, a few neighbors stopped them. One woman offered a small smile. I'm sorry for doubting you. We should have done more. Ava gave a faint smile back. It's not about blame. It's about learning when to stand up. As they walked home under the dim streetlights, Ethan squeezed her hand. You realize what you just did in there, right? She looked up at him. Spoke my mind? He shook his head. You turned fear into power. Her lips curved into a quiet smile. Maybe. Or maybe I just got tired of being quiet. For the first time in weeks, her shoulders loosened as they stepped onto their porch. The same porch where she once felt watched now felt like solid ground again. The fight wasn't over, but the silence was. The following morning came quiet and bright, the kind of sunlight that made the whole neighborhood look harmless again. For the first time in a long time, Ava didn't wake with her heart pounding. She made coffee, stood by the kitchen window, and watched people passing on the sidewalk. Children laughed on their way to the bus stop. Sprinklers clicked rhythmically across the lawns. Peace for once didn't feel foreign. Ethan joined her, his hand brushing lightly against her back. You should go for your walk, he said softly. You said you missed it. She hesitated. I don't want to be the woman people stare at. He shook his head. You're not. You're the woman they remember for standing up. That afternoon, Ava did exactly that. She laced her shoes, stepped outside, and walked toward Cedar Trail again. The sun was warm on her shoulders. A few neighbors waved, and this time she waved back. Not out of politeness, but out of choice. Halfway down the block, she passed an older man watering his garden. He straightened up, nodding to her. Glad to see you back out, ma'am. Whole place feels different when people stop walking. She smiled faintly. Then I guess we should keep walking. When she reached the park, the sound of children playing filled the air. It was the same patch of grass where she had fallen, where fear had made her small. But standing there now, she felt taller. The memory still existed, but it no longer controlled her. Grace jogged past again, waving. You're making this place brave again, she called out between breaths. Ava laughed softly. One step at a time. Back home, Ethan was waiting on the porch with 2 glasses of lemonade. They sat together, the golden light slipping across their faces. For a while, they didn't need words. The silence was easy, the kind that belonged to peace rather than fear. Then Ava spoke, her voice thoughtful. I keep thinking about that day. How everyone froze, how some people filmed instead of helped, how easy it is to stand still when something feels wrong. Ethan nodded, Fear does that. But courage can spread just as fast if someone takes the first step. She looked at him, her eyes steady. So maybe that's what we do now. Keep stepping forward. Keep reminding people what standing up looks like. He smiled. You already have. Weeks later, Maple Ridge slowly began to change. Neighbors who hadn't spoken in years started greeting each other again. New community patrols were formed, real ones, trained and verified. The HOA installed cameras and organized safety workshops. But more importantly, people began to talk about courage differently. They didn't whisper about the attack anymore. They spoke about what it meant to act when others hesitated. They mentioned Ava's name not with pity but with respect. At a small neighborhood gathering a month later, Mark Heller raised a glass and said, "We used to think security came from rules and fences. Turns out it comes from people who refuse to be silent." The crowd nodded, some clapping quietly. Ava smiled, holding Ethan's hand under the table. That night, as the two of them walked home under a sky speckled with stars, she asked, "Do you think people really change? Or do they just learn how to hide fear better?" Ethan glanced at her, the corner of his mouth lifting. "They change when someone shows them how." "You did that." She shook her head. "We did." They stopped in front of their house. The porch light glowed softly. The same steps that had once felt like a barrier now felt like safety. Ava turned to him, her eyes catching the light. "Do you think it'll ever go away?" "The fear?" He thought for a moment. "No, but it'll stop being the first thing you feel. One day you'll walk down that street and you won't remember them. You'll just remember you didn't let them win." Ava exhaled slowly. "That's enough." They went inside together. The house smelled like lemon soap and fresh air. The world outside still held shadows, but inside it was light. And in that quiet, the truth of it settled. Courage wasn't the absence of fear. It was the decision to move anyway. To keep walking even when your knees shake. To speak even when your voice trembles. To stand your ground when the world tells you to stay small. Because silence never keeps anyone safe. The next morning, Ava wrote something down on a small piece of paper and pinned it to the fridge. Ethan noticed it when he poured his coffee. It read, "No uniform gives power. Only integrity does." He smiled, nodding once to himself. Outside, a soft breeze moved through the street. A new family was unloading boxes into a house across from theirs. The sound of laughter carried through the air. Ava stepped out onto the porch, watching them for a moment, the corner of her mouth curving upward. She'd been through something dark, but she had walked straight through it and found the light waiting on the other side. And she knew something now, something the imposters never understood. Strength isn't about control. It's about knowing your worth and never letting fear rewrite who you are. She glanced back at Ethan through the open door and said quietly, "I think I'm ready." He smiled, eyes warm. "For what?" "For tomorrow." The world outside felt calm again, but it wasn't the same kind of calm as before. It was stronger, earned. And as the sun lifted higher over Maple Ridge, the woman who once walked home in fear took her first confident step into a new day, one defined not by what was taken from her, but by what she refused to give away. Her peace, her voice, her courage,